1898, deep in colonial Kenya, the night was never silent. Something stalked the railway camps. Silent, merciless, unstoppable.
Two male lions,
Oh.
with no manes, no fear, no discernible pattern. And they didn't kill just to eat. It seemed like they killed, well, to kill. This isn't some campfire legend. This actually happened. And when you look at the sources, it's genuinely one of the most terrifying and frankly baffling wildlife stories ever recorded.
Right, so for this deep dive, we've got quite a pile of material you've pulled together. There are historical accounts, Patterson's famous memoir, of course, but also modern scientific analysis of the lions themselves, and even some reflections on how the story's been told, especially in film.
Exactly. The mission, if you like, is to unpack what really went down near the Tsavo River back then. We need to understand the different angles the sources give us because they don't always agree.
And see what we can learn from this really chilling chapter where, humanity came face to face with predatory nature in a very raw way.
And it all unfolded against the backdrop of this huge British project, the Kenya-Uganda Railway.
Ah, yes, the lunatic line, as they called it. I mean, a colossal colonial undertaking. Stretching all the way from Mombasa on the coast, deep inland towards Lake Victoria, to what eventually became Port Florence or Kisumu.
And this wasn't just about laying track. You have to understand, the sources make it clear, this was pure geopolitics for the British Empire. Staking a claim in East Africa, pushing back against rivals like Germany, France.
Part of that whole scramble for Africa.
Precisely. And while the British sometimes framed it, partly as an anti-slavery measure, the reality for the workforce building it was, well, it's incredibly harsh.
Yeah, thousands of laborers. Sources say predominantly brought over from India, many as indentured workers alongside local African labor, often treated little better than slaves, really. The conditions were brutal even before the lions showed up. Disease, exhaustion, the sheer danger of the work.
Absolutely. Hardship was baked into the project. And the absolute focal point for this particular horror story became the Tsavo River area. A critical bridge needed to be built there.
And that's where Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson comes in. The sources tell us he arrived in March 1898. He was a civil engineer, but also, importantly, an experienced hunter. His job was to get that bridge built.
There's also that chilling detail from the sources about the name Tsavo itself. Locally, it apparently meant something like place of slaughter.
Which originally referred to, what, historical conflicts between tribes?
Yes, exactly. But for the men working on that railway line, it took on this awful, almost prophetic meaning. Because like you said, almost as soon as Patterson got there, the attack started.
Men just vanishing, dragged from their tents in the dead of night. At first, maybe it was dismissed, isolated incidents.
Probably. But it didn't stay isolated for long. It escalated quickly and terrifyingly.
And Patterson, the man in charge, he wasn't just an engineer. He was, as we said, a hunter. And maybe most importantly for history, he was a writer. His 1907 memoir, The Man-Eaters of Tsavo, that's really our main window into this whole ordeal.
It's a gripping account. And of course, it's the book that eventually inspired that big Hollywood movie, The Ghost in the Darkness, back in '96.
But the reality Patterson lays out in his book, it feels even starker somehow than the film.
I think so too. These weren't just occasional attacks. They became relentless, night after night sometimes. The workers tried everything, building these thick thorn barriers, bomas, around the camps, keeping huge fires blazing all night, imposing strict curfews.
But nothing seemed to deter these lions. They got bolder, more vicious.
The descriptions in the sources are harrowing. Screams in the dark, tents being ripped apart, men dragged out screaming. There's one horrific account of the lions actually breaking into a hospital tent and seizing patients from their beds.
Unbelievable. And another report mentions a British district officer being attacked, his sergeant killed right beside him. The fear must have been absolutely paralyzing.
It was, so much so that the entire railway project, it just stopped. Construction on that vital Tsavo Bridge completely halted for about 3 months. From December 1898 till Patterson finally dealt with the lions. Think about that, stopping a major imperial project in its tracks.
And the human cost. This is where the sources really start to give different pictures, isn't it? Patterson himself, especially in later writings, claimed a truly staggering number. Up to 135 workers killed.
135, that's the number that sticks in most people's minds, largely thanks to Patterson and the movie.
But then you look at the official railway company records from the time. They only acknowledged 28 deaths directly caused by the lions, a huge difference.
And then, fast forward to modern science. Researchers studying the lions' remains, their bones, their hair came up with a third estimate. Based on isotopic analysis of what they actually consumed, they reckon the two lions ate about 35 people, particularly in those final few months.
So we have 135, 28, and around 35. These conflicting numbers are fascinating in themselves. They tell you a lot about who was keeping the records and why, right? You've got Patterson maybe emphasizing the scale of the terror he faced. You've got the railway company possibly wanting to downplay the disaster.
Exactly. And then science, giving us this forensic look at consumption.
Which is incredibly valuable data, but it doesn't necessarily capture everyone killed, does it? Maybe the lions didn't eat every victim. Or maybe some killings happened earlier, outside the window the isotopic analysis covered.
It forces you, the listener, to really think critically about historical sources, about whose story gets told and who gets counted. And it wasn't just the killing or the numbers that was strange.
Yeah.
These lions were, well, they were behaving oddly compared to typical lion behavior. Usually adult males live in prides, right? They defend territory together.
But these were two adult males operating as a team, but apparently outside a pride structure. That's pretty unusual.
Very unusual. And then there's the famous detail. They were maneless. Now, while most male lions do have manes, sources confirm that maneless males aren't totally unheard of, particularly in that Tsavo region. Could be genetics, environmental factors, maybe even injury during development.
They were also described as being unusually large, tall, long bodies?
Yes. And their killing behavior was also puzzling. Patterson and others reported that they didn't always eat their victims fully, which for predators supposedly driven solely by hunger is odd. It fueled all sorts of speculation at the time. Were they defending territory? Was it sickness? Or something more, sinister, as the terrified workers came to believe?
So it all leads to that big question, the one that hangs over this whole story. Why? Why did these two lions at this specific time and place become such prolific man-eaters?
And that's where the modern scientific investigation, the actual remains, the ones now in the Field Museum in Chicago, really comes into play. Science has tried to piece together an answer.
And it looks like it wasn't just one single thing, right? More like a combination of factors.
Exactly. One major finding relates to their ability to hunt their usual prey. Examining the skulls revealed that one of the lions, the first one Patterson killed, the one analysis suggests 8 more people had serious dental problems. A badly abscessed canine tooth, a fractured tooth socket.
Ouch. That would make it incredibly painful, maybe impossible, to take down and kill large, struggling prey like a zebra or a buffalo.
Precisely. But humans, relatively slow, soft-skinned, suddenly look like a much easier, less painful option. So desperation for that individual lion seems very likely.
Okay, so injury is one piece. What else?
Well, there's the possibility of wider food scarcity. Maybe their natural prey, buffalo, zebra, wildebeest, were less abundant in the Tsavo region at that time. Could have been drought, or maybe an outbreak of rinderpest, a devastating cattle disease that also hit wild-hoofed animals hard.
Less food means more pressure on predators to find alternatives.
And humans were, tragically, quite accessible. Sources mention the makeshift nature of the camps, potentially poor burial practices for workers who died of other causes, and there's the grim historical context. This area had been part of slave trading routes, where unburied bodies might have been found historically.
So they might have first got a taste for humans by scavenging.
It's a strong possibility. Scavenging could have led to habituation. They learned humans are an easy food source. And once that line is crossed, especially for an injured lion, maybe hunting humans becomes the preferred or necessary strategy. It's learned behavior reinforced by success.
Behavioral conditioning, essentially.
Pretty much. And the modern science gives us some incredible detail here. They did DNA analysis on tiny bits of hair found trapped in the lion's teeth. They found DNA from giraffe, oryx, waterbuck, wildebeest, zebra, but also human. And even, surprisingly, other lions.
Other lions? Wow, so they weren't just eating people.
No, it seems they had a varied diet and possibly ranged quite widely. But humans were definitely a significant part of it, especially towards the end. The isotope analysis that's looking at chemical signatures in their bones and hair keratin gave a picture of their diet over time.
And that's where the estimate of around 35 people consumed comes from.
Yes. The analysis suggested human remains made up about 30% of the diet for the lion with the bad teeth in its final months, and maybe around 8% for its partner. The lion with the dental issues was estimated to have eaten roughly 24 people, the other one about 11.
And there was something about how they ate, too, the microwear analysis.
Right. Looking at microscopic wear patterns on their teeth suggested they were eating softer foods more often than typical lions who crush a lot of bone. That fits with the idea of preferring softer human flesh, possibly due to those jaw injuries or just because it was easier.
So science offers these compelling puzzle pieces: injury, opportunity, maybe scarcity. It explains a lot of the how and why.
It does. But even with the science, you read Patterson's account, you think about the sheer terror those workers faced night after night. The scientific explanation doesn't completely dispel the chilling aura around these animals.
Hmm.
The mechanics are clear, but the experience of being hunted by them remains profound.
And Patterson knew he was the one who had to stop it. The railway, the lives of his men, it all depended on him hunting down these hunters.
And it wasn't easy. His attempts were often desperate and frequently failed. He built elaborate traps, including that famous boxcar trap. Though it's worth noting, the sources suggest the movie's depiction of using human prisoners as bait is inaccurate. Patterson mentions using armed sepoys, or possibly animals.
He tried ambushing them from trees, right? Which sounds incredibly dangerous.
Extremely. He recounts one terrifying night where he was waiting in a flimsy structure, a mashan,
Hmm.
and one of the lions actually stalked him below. He had to fire blindly down into the darkness just to scare it off. He was nearly killed himself several times.
And even when they brought in other officials, other hunters, armed soldiers, these lions just seemed incredibly elusive, almost supernaturally clever at avoiding traps while continuing their attacks.
But Patterson didn't give up. He finally got the first lion on December 9th, 1898. Accounts vary a little on exactly how many shots it took. Some say multiple hits were needed. Patterson's own account suggests a first shot injured it, and a second, later shot to the heart finally brought it down.
And it was huge, wasn't it?
Massive, measured nearly 10 feet long, 9 feet 8 inches, nose to tail tip. Took 8 men just to carry the carcass back to the camp. The relief must have been immense.
But there was still one more.
Yes, he hunted the second lion for another 3 weeks, finally killed it on December 29th, 1898. Only then was the specific reign of terror by these 2 lions over. Construction could finally restart.
And what happened to the bodies? Patterson had them skinned?
He did. Initially, he had the skins turned into floor rugs, which was pretty typical for hunting trophies at the time. But years later, in 1925, he gave a lecture at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago.
And ended up selling the skins and the skulls to them for $5,000, the sources say.
That's right. And the museum then had them professionally taxidermied. So you can actually go and see the Tsavo man-eaters today. They're on permanent display in Chicago.
Though apparently they look a bit smaller now than they were in life because the skins were trimmed when they were made into those rugs.
Yeah, that process altered their original dimensions somewhat, but they're still incredibly imposing.
And of course, the story didn't just stay in museums or memoirs. It hit Hollywood, The Ghost in the Darkness.
Which is a thrilling movie. But, as we've touched on, the sources show it takes quite a few liberties with the facts for dramatic effect.
Yeah, like being filmed in South Africa, not Kenya. Giving the lions big manes when the real ones were maneless. Inventing that whole Remington character, played by Michael Douglas Patterson, did most of the hunting himself. Or with local trackers and sepoys who weren't always successful.
And that scene with the prisoners used as bait, definitely not in Patterson's account. He mentioned using armed soldiers, sepoys, or possibly animal bait.
And the death toll discrepancy gets amplified by the movie, too, often using Patterson's highest figure of 135.
Right. We've got that contested range, Patterson's 135, the official railway count of 28, and the scientific estimate of around 35 consumed.
The science backing the lower number, around 35 consumed, certainly makes Patterson's highest claim seem less likely based purely on what these 2 lions ate in that specific period.
It does suggest the consumption was closer to the official railway numbers, perhaps. But again, it doesn't completely rule out that they killed more without eating them, or killed others earlier on. The full picture remains elusive. There's this fog of history, uncertainty.
And some historians are rightly skeptical about certain details in Patterson's book, like him finding a supposed lion's den filled with human bones. It sounds a bit sensationalized.
It does, but then you have to balance that against the context. Colonial record-keeping, especially for non-European workers, was often poor. Their lives and deaths weren't always deemed worthy of meticulous documentation by the British authorities.
And the railway company definitely had motivation to minimize the disaster, didn't they? Bad for morale, bad for finances, bad for the image of the empire being stopped by, wildlife issues.
Absolutely. So pinning down that precise number of victims is probably impossible now. It's lost to history, in a way.
But what wasn't lost, what comes through loud and clear from all sources, regardless of the exact body count, was the fear. The absolute paralyzing terror in those camps.
That's the undeniable core of it. the impact on the workers, the fact that construction literally stopped, men huddling by fires all night or building desperate shelters on top of water tanks, on roofs, inside bridge girders, even digging pits to hide in, listening to the lions roaring outside, or worse, the sounds of them feeding. That fear was intensely real.
And we can't talk about this story without acknowledging the wider context: British colonialism in East Africa. This railway wasn't just track and bridges, it was an instrument of empire.
Built for strategic control, economic gain. And the workforce, primarily the African and Indian laborers, they were the ones on the front line, facing all the dangers, not just lions, but disease, brutal conditions, exploitation, often completely voiceless in the official narrative.
Their suffering is often just a footnote in the grand imperial story, only really illuminated through accounts like Patterson's or later historical digging.
And the lions themselves became symbols, didn't they? For some of the workers, steeped in their own beliefs, they weren't just animals. They were seen as evil spirits, maybe avenging spirits of local chiefs whose land was being violated by the railway.
A supernatural explanation for an unnatural horror.
Or, looking at it more broadly, as some sources suggest, you can see them as a kind of raw, physical embodiment of nature pushing back against the intrusion and disruption of the colonial project. Nature's resistance in tooth and claw.
It's a powerful lens, and after Patterson finally killed them, there's that detail about the workers presenting him with a silver bowl.
Yes, inscribed with their thanks for saving their lives. Patterson apparently treasured it above all his other hunting trophies. It's a complex moment, immense relief from the terror, gratitude directed at the man who ended it, all layered onto this backdrop of colonial power dynamics.
Patterson's own life took some interesting turns after Tsavo, too.
It really did. He went on to have a significant military career, commanding the Jewish Legion during World War I, a unit composed largely of Jewish volunteers, seen by some historians as a forerunner of the Israeli Defense Forces.
He became a prominent supporter of Zionism, friends with figures like Ze'ev Jabotinsky and Benzion Netanyahu.
Whose son, Yonatan Netanyahu, the Israeli hero killed at Entebbe, was actually named after Patterson. And Patterson himself, fulfilling his own wish, was eventually reburied alongside his wife in Israel in 2014, honored by Israeli leaders as a supporter of their cause.
Quite a trajectory for the man famous for hunting lions in Africa.
It is. And the Tsavo story itself, it hasn't faded away. It still comes up in discussions about human-wildlife conflict today, about conservation in that very region, Tsavo National Park. And it remains woven into local folklore and history in Kenya.
So looking back at everything, all these sources, what's the final thought? For me, it feels like in Tsavo, something shifted. Nature, maybe wounded by empire, maybe driven by injury and hunger, just struck back violently.
Two lions walked where humans were trying to impose their will. And for 9 terrifying months, they, not the engineers or the empire, effectively ruled that stretch of land. They weren't ghosts or demons, despite the terror they caused.
No, they were apex predators, thrown into a deadly intersection with human expansion, driven by a complex mix of biological necessity and maybe just sheer opportunity. Their story is this incredibly visceral, unforgettable reminder
That we are not always at the top of the food chain.
Thank you for being on this journey with us, diving deep into the sources and the chilling story of the man-eaters of Tsavo. Stay curious, stay grounded, and stay tuned for the next one.